So we're in part 9 of our series on things Jesus said, where I've kind of just taken different phrases that stand out about his ministry and not necessarily doing a detailed, in-depth teaching every time on what the phrase means completely, but how it works in a particular passage. And it's not a phrase today, it's just one word. The word rejoice. And for the text, I chose Luke chapter 6, verses 22 and 23. This, of course, is Jesus speaking. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. In other words, on account of Jesus. Verse 23, rejoice, so there's the word. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did to the prophets. So it's interesting when people who don't have a background in the New Testament, when they read that passage, they're understandably surprised at how Jesus redefines the concept of rejoicing, because the world tells us to rejoice whenever things are going well. But Jesus does the opposite here, right? He tells us to rejoice even when we're being mistreated. And the reason is that Christians, the reason Christians can rejoice when things are going wrong is because we are different than the world in terms of how we look at life. As Christians, now I'm speaking in general terms, in ideal terms, but as Christians, we don't interpret our circumstances in the same way the world does. And that's because when we encountered Jesus and became his followers, we began to see things differently. We began to see something deeper, something spiritual. And now we're in that process of beginning to understand that what's actually important is not necessarily the same thing as the world claims as important. We see life differently. And to illustrate this idea, Jesus once told a really short parable. It's short, but it's powerful, about how his followers see things differently than others. And it's one verse, Matthew 13, verse 44. Here's the parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. And so you don't actually need a lot of background to understand that parable. It's kind of clear what Jesus is saying. He's saying when people see God for who he really is, and they begin to realize how wonderful it is to know him, right? To have that relationship. When that happens, then the things that they used to love, the things of the world, begin to seem less important because they found something better. And that realization that Jesus is better than the rewards of this world, that's what makes Christians willing to give up the things that we used to love. And it's not a harsh requirement where God forces us to give up those things. Jesus makes it clear in the parable that these people, hopefully this is us, that when we give up those things that used to mean something to us, we're happy to do it. Look again at the middle of verse 44 of Matthew 13. It says, in his joy, who? The person that finds the treasure, salvation. In his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. It's a joyful thing. Now, obviously, Jesus is taking a process that takes place over a lifetime, right? And he's shortening it into a single verse. I don't know any Christian who instantly, when they become a follower of Jesus, wants to give up everything for the joy of knowing the Lord. At least that's not been my experience. Maybe it's yours. If it is, you're way ahead of me. But But at the same time, most every Christian I know is on that journey, right? We're moving away from the world and what it values, and we're drawing closer to God. Now, there's fits and starts, there's ups and downs. But that's the journey God's had me on for most of my life, where the world still has a hold on me to a degree, but not like it once did. Because more and more, I'm discovering the real joy of following Jesus. And I'm also discovering that this world doesn't satisfy. And real joy, like actual deep joy, is found in knowing the Lord. That's the treasure, right? Knowing the Lord. And then this world kind of begins to fade a little bit. And this whole idea illustrates one of the what I think is a common misunderstanding that people have about salvation in the kingdom of God. I have talked to a lot of people who are not Christians, and they don't want to follow Jesus because they think it will make them unhappy. They have this idea that once you become a Christian, God takes away everything you like, and he forces you to live in a way that's miserable. Right? Tell me you haven't heard that. Maybe you've had that idea. But truth be told, I think sometimes the reason people think that is because of their experience with Christians who appeared miserable. We've all been around people like that, people who were in church every Sunday, but they always seemed unhappy. Right? Now, here's what I would argue. If you meet someone in church who tells you they're a Christian, but they're always miserable and unhappy, I'm not saying they're not a Christian, but I am saying that if you're caught in that trap, it's probably and possibly because you lack a full understanding of what salvation really is. I'm not talking about people that struggle with depression because of some kind of chemical imbalance. That's a whole different thing. I'm just talking about people that are miserable and upset all the time and grumpy and, all those words, right? I think they lack a full understanding of what salvation is. And the reason I say that is actually quite simple. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor, but I do understand the word gospel. So if you read the New Testament, right, the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're called the Gospels, and they tell the story of Jesus. So I put Mark 1 verse 1 in your outline because it uses this word, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So in the technical sense, a gospel is one of the 4 books of the New Testament that purports to give the stories of Jesus' life. However, when you actually look the word gospel up in the Greek language that the New Testament was written in, it's the word euangelion, and it literally means good news. That's all it means. It was a common word back then. It means good news, and that's important because it tells you if knowing Jesus is good news, then the Christian life was never meant to be unhappy. God's will is not that we just struggle along, hoping we'll make it, kind of dour and grim and Knowing Jesus is good news. Because it brings you a whole new outlook on life. When you've experienced Jesus, it changes how you see things, and you look at your circumstances not just with the eyes of worldly experience as you did in the past. You begin to have a spiritual perspective on how things work. And this new perspective, this new way of looking at things is what Jesus was talking about in that parable we just read. Let's read it one more time. Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, there's those 3 words, in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Now, I'm going to take the risk of sounding a little bit critical here. And I want to be very careful because I don't want to be that guy that is always criticizing those who came before me. But I want to say this anyway. I think, this is only my experience, you can disagree with me and we can fight in the discussion time at the end if you want, but I think that some Christians in previous generations, talking about when I was a kid and looking at the older adults in the church churches that I remember, I think some of them missed something in that their greatest strength, and I'll talk about what I mean here, their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. And here's what I mean when I say that. Tom Brokaw, he was the NBC News anchor for years. And he wrote a book called The Greatest Generation, again, years ago, about the generation of Americans that fought in World War II. And I read the book, and his point essentially was that generation, not every individual, but as a group, they usually did the right thing simply because it was the right thing. I'm not saying they were perfect because nobody's perfect. But if you think about it, historically, that generation worked incredibly hard to create so much of what we enjoy today. The infrastructure of this country, that generation for the most part built it. And the reason they did that was so that generations after them, us, wouldn't struggle in the same way they did. They were the ones that came out of the Great Depression. They fought World War II, and I think I looked the number up. About 400,000 Americans died in that war, and they paid a high price. And again, when you read the stories of that generation, the reason they did all this was simply because it was the right thing to do, and they were used to making sacrifices for the greater good. That they were just an amazing group of people. Again, not every individual, but society as a whole. And this willingness to work hard and do the right thing simply because it was the right thing, it was in some ways their greatest strength. You know, if it wasn't for them, who knows where we'd be. But, and here's where I want to maybe take issue with some of them. For that generation, those who were Christians, this working hard because it's the right thing was also their greatest weakness. For many of them, and I remember this when I was a kid, they would do the right thing because it was right, but oftentimes they did it without any real sense of joy. And I remember what this was like growing up in church, because when I was a kid, the World War II generation was like my age now. And I remember those people. And we were always in Assemblies of God churches, which were famous for the way they worshiped, right? And there was always people that worshiped God with joyful abandon. But there were people in all the congregations I remember, they just couldn't do it. Again, people that were my age and a little bit older. And later I found out, in many cases, it was because they had been through so much in their life, so much heartache and trauma and suffering, that they just could not experience that feeling of deep joy. And also, as I got older and began to hear their stories, I found out that many people in that time, they were, from the time they were raised as kids, they were taught not to express their feelings openly. In many cases, they were told that it's wrong, it's foolish to get too emotional, and that you need to control yourself and just do the right thing. And again, I don't want to sound disrespectful. I appreciate the fact that they did so much to build many of the things that we enjoy today. And yet there's part of me that makes me wish they had felt a little more free to do something as simple as telling God how much they loved Him in an open way, and to receive the fullness of the joy that He wanted them to have. And I'm not just picking on the World War II generation. There's always been groups of people that have had this. In Jesus' day, which is why He told this parable, there were Jewish people who did the right thing. I mean, they followed the requirements of the Old Testament law down to the letter, and they did it because they knew it was right, and they were the kinds of people who did the right thing, but they didn't really fully understand this idea of the joy of the Lord. And because of that, they didn't experience all that God had for them. And that's why Jesus tells this parable about rejoicing. This was for people in his day and in the World War II generation, and in some cases in our day. This was for people who didn't understand the joy of the Lord and what it is to just experience his goodness in a way that impacts you deeply. So let's read that parable one more time. Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up, and then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. I was thinking as I was preparing this teaching that it might come across that I'm talking about a style of worship. I'm not. I'm not talking about singing upbeat songs. I'm not talking about raising your hands in worship or dancing or whatever. There's nothing wrong with any of those things, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm simply saying that you and I, as followers of Jesus, have had a glimpse of eternity. I've never seen heaven, but I've had moments where I felt, wow, this must be what heaven is like. And those little glimpses I've had, those little moments, those little experiences, have made me to understand that nothing this world sees as valuable could ever begin to compare with the kingdom of God and the presence of God. And because we've had that little glimpse of God's kingdom, that's what motivates us to push forward in him and ask for a joy, a deep-seated joy that transcends anything this world can offer. And so whenever I get discouraged about life, the one thing I've learned to do, admittedly it's taken me many decades, and I'm not perfect in this, but the one thing I've learned to do is to stop and kind of take a little breath and ask God to remind me of what's actually important. Because the things that I get discouraged about oftentimes aren't nearly as important as they seem in the moment. And God has a way of reminding me when I ask him that it's not my earthly circumstances that are all that important. My earthly situation does not matter nearly as much as I think right then. What actually matters, and the reason I can have joy no matter what's happening around me, what actually matters is eternity. And that I'm going to be in God's presence forever. That's what matters. That's what really matters. That's what actually matters. So let me leave you with something Paul said, which I need to hear from time to time. Colossians 3, verses 2 through 4. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. That's what matters. And that's why we can have joy.